if you can't go to the market with some sexy renders and some great usable floor plans, you might be in strife.
You are listening to the Property Developer Podcast, your home for tips, ideas and inspiration to help take your developing to the next level. Now here's your host, Justin Getty.
Hello listener, and welcome to this episode of the Property Developer Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you take your developing business to the next level. Thanks for listening, and I trust you are well. Today I'm talking design with architect Dom Cerantonio from Cera Stribley Architects. Design is such an integral element of property development and can often be the difference between getting a planning approval or not. Plus, it can also affect demand for your product and influence how you are perceived in the market. I ended up engaging Dom to help me with my project after we had trouble getting our proposed scheme through council, and he did a great job of coming up with a terrific design that council supported, and we got our approval, and I dubbed him the Weapon. I learnt a couple of good tips during our conversation around how to qualify if your designer is right for you and your project, a great way to negotiate on fees, and why good design makes a difference. I started out by asking Dom the obligatory question about what food he would eat until he was ill.
Chocolate.
Really?
Yeah.
Any kind of chocolate?
Just plain old chocolate.
Dark chocolate? Milk chocolate?
Milk, dairy milk, plain.
Yeah.
I could eat 3 blocks of it and be fine.
Really?
Yeah, it's a problem.
So how many until you were sick then?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. It gives me energy. It allows me to keep going.
Is that the expensive Swiss stuff? Or
No. Just plain old Cadbury's. I'm good.
It's always good to find out what people's little treats are.
First thing that comes to mind. It's probably what I want right now.
Well, we'll see. If you do a good interview, you might get some at the end.
Good. Sounds good.
Now, Dom, can you tell us a little bit about your background as an architect and why you decided to become an architect?
Yeah, sure. Mum was an architect. Grew up reading architecture magazines as opposed to, I don't know, whatever else on the Women's Weekly or whatever else. Yeah, so grew up with architecture, spent a lot of time with Mum in her office working and whatnot, and just I think grew up with a taste and a feel for it that really led me down a path I didn't know anyone anywhere else to go.
Did you have your own little desk and were those drafting tables?
Yeah, I actually did. Mum, my school holidays, Mum used to give me a little book, and obviously now computers have changed the way we do architecture, but back then you used to hand draw everything, obviously, and there's a range of different symbols that you're required to know and understand to draw an architectural plan. So what does a shower look like? What does a toilet look like? What does a cart look like? Mum had this little book that everything was kind of outlined, detailed and explained for you. So Mum gave me the book and I'd just sit there drawing away all day during school holidays. So probably should have been outside kicking a football, but no, I was in there drawing. And that obviously you learn a bunch of stuff doing that, and you get a taste of it. And that's what I loved, and that was my passion, and led me down this path.
So what was it about drawing or architecture that gets your blood boiling?
I think initially just being able to create something tangible. That if you look at art and art as a discipline, you're talking about creating something, turning a concept that you're thinking into something that's visible, I suppose. And of course, art takes on the physical form, in sculpture, whether it's painting or whatever else. Architecture is quite different in a sense. It's how we live, how we use, how we operate through a space, and being able to create that is really important, and I guess gets me really interested, intrigued. At the start of any project, you kind of, well, how do we look at this? How do we do this? How do we think about how who's going to be living here? Who's going to be using this space, working here, eating here, training here, and how are they going to use the space? And how can we manipulate the areas within that space to make their experience better? And that's something that's exciting to us, for sure.
Yeah, it would be, particularly when it's done really well.
Yeah, and part of the charm of architecture is seeing a drawing or an idea that then turns into a drawing, and then that drawing turns into a working drawing, and then that working drawing turns into something that's actually tangible and it starts being constructed, and you can start walking through that space, and that whole experience of going from idea to reality is fascinating. It's really something special.
Yeah, which for property developing and for property developers, I think that's a big driving force for them as well, just having something go from an idea to actual reality.
Yeah. Well, look, developers have got a lot of big ideas, and a lot of those guys that it's not just architects that have ideas. We might be the instrument that allows you to get from one place to another. The developers got the same, so they do experience the same kind of journey, obviously in a different way. But I can see how it'd be equally as exciting for them.
Yeah, well, it's definitely a very symbiotic relationship between the designer and the developer.
Yeah, of course, and that relationship is really important, because if you can work well together, I think you can create some really strong synergies between client and architect. I think ultimately you get a better project. If you're fighting all the way along, you're just not going to get anywhere. And I think there's a role to be played on both parts. I think the architect needs to listen and not try and drive their own agenda the whole way through. It's more about trying to get an understanding of what the developer's trying to achieve, and then being able to use that. Then yes, of course, if they want to put their own spin on it, fine. But you've got to work with the developer on what they're trying to achieve. And equally, the developer's got to listen to the architect as well. We are the expert, I suppose, but the developer needs to listen to the architect and not try and push all the time, because there are certain things that will ultimately become a problem later down the track. So I think there's a bit of give and take on both parts, but I think if you can get it right, it can be a great experience. And
so what kind of things would the developer push on, and what things would you best leave to the architect?
Oh, look, there's an array of different things. For an example, in any project, the developer's going to try and push the project to its boundaries to maximise the yield, the potential of any project, and that's what you should do. But there will be times when you can't do something. Now, let's just say the planning scheme calls for 3 levels. And I'm taking this is a really simple example, but unless say developer wants to go to 4 levels, and we can explain to them, well, you can't go 4 levels, or you might be able to, right? Because planning scheme is a guide only. If we're telling them no, so I was going, I don't care. What that can do is it can just cause what might be a 6 month planning process might turn into 15 months or 12 months, all because of one little thing. Now, I guess my school of thought when it comes to property development is really get in, get out. The quicker you're turning over projects, the quicker you're going to be making money. It's not always about max, because if you're wasting 12 months in council, well, that's 12 months where you could be working on something else. So having that as an example, I just think sometimes it isn't always about yet. We'd like to think it is, but sometimes time needs to be considered a bit more. It's often the forgotten aspect of development.
Yeah, well, it certainly ticks by pretty quickly when you're either waiting for something or needing something. It goes pretty quickly. Yeah,
and holding costs are always forgotten. If you're sitting on a block of land that owes you, or it costs $5 million for argument's sake, and you get repayments on that for 12 months that you didn't otherwise expect, that can add up pretty quick. Especially if that property's not returning any income through rent or whatever other method. So time is important, and I think, and unfortunately, there's a lot of red tape in the current system, which we can all bitch and moan about, but that's the reality. So adding any unnecessary aspect which may delay the project further, I just think is just we should try and avoid it at all costs.
So in order to establish a good relationship or set yourself up for success with an architect, are there things that you would suggest developers do in terms of some due diligence on an architect, or questions to ask, or how can you lay the foundations to have that good, strong relationship?
Look, I can't speak for other architects out there, but for us, if I was a developer and I was choosing an architect, the first thing I'd be doing is asking them to prepare a feasibility plan. We don't charge for that service. We would rather show our potential new clients what we think we can do with a project, and that it kind of, I guess, sets up the basis for a good relationship. I think there are a lot of great architects out there, but having a commercially minded architect when it comes to property development is incredibly important. Now, you'll be able to tell that quite quickly with a feasibility plan. It doesn't take long. Some architects might charge you a small fee for that, some might do it for nothing. But going through that process, I suppose that's their DD process for a developer, will allow the developer, to understand what the architects are going to do down the track. If you're talking about a site where the developer might think they can get, call it 10 townhouses on there, and the architect comes back with 6 huge ones in a market where there's a very low ceiling on the product, well, you probably that may not be the best road to go down. Whereas the architect comes back and they're talking to you about the market factors, construction costs versus sales and what ceilings are at. You might be able to do 3 bedrooms, and it might be better to do 2 bedrooms because there's a certain cap in the area, and that demographic of people aren't going to pay more than 800,000, call it. So going through that process and letting the architect to talk through the issues, I think is important, because you want an architect who understands that. Otherwise, you may be forced into a position where you might get lost.
But is that the developer's role to then guide the architect and say, I'd like to try and get 10 on here because that's what's suitable for the market?
I think it's a case of both parties working together. You can have a developer that can be quite strong in what they want and set briefs, and this is what we want, this is what we want, and that's fine. And the architect can just play along with that. But quite often, the architect needs to understand the factors, because it ultimately will allow them to search for a better outcome on the site. So there'll be times when there'll be certain things the architect's working through in terms of the planning policies and whatnot, and working out where you can push things and where you can't. Now, having an understanding of the market will ultimately determine where you can push and pull, and that's really important. It's not just a case of developer going, this is what I want, 10 townhouses, 3 bedrooms, 5 or 2 bedrooms, max 120 square metres, 130 square metres, or whatever it is. The architect should know that stuff as well, or at least have a general understanding.
Yeah, because I think the risk is if you give the architect carte blanche to design whatever they want, the risk is they will design something that they like, as opposed to something that's commercially viable and gives the highest yield for that particular area.
And that's exactly my point. If you do a feasibility, if you create a feasibility process and you offer the architect, you might suggest to them, this is what we're thinking. You'll be able to tell quite quickly what to expect when you get that feasibility.
And so can you just describe what that feasibility would look like?
Yeah, so we do a number of these for our clients. Essentially, there'll be a couple of plans, maybe with some floor layouts on them, maybe not. But essentially what it will describe is your yield, the sizes of the dwellings, so whether they're apartments or townhouses or retail units or whatever, childcare centres, how big. They'll describe how many bedrooms, if we're doing a childcare centre, how many children. And what that does is it informs the client, okay, this is what I can do. I can get X amount of apartments. It's going to cost me this much to build. And they can, doing a very high level feasibility, they can kind of work out what the site's worth, whether it's worth doing the project or whether it's not. So that's the instrument that kind of, I guess, allows the developer to make an informed decision about the project and whether they want to pursue it or not. That can go further. We do have a client where they like to get a lot of 3D work done, renders, because they incorporate a number of retail groups prior to purchasing a site. So that's taking a feasibility to the next level, which we don't really do a lot, but that can be done. And you can have a full design done sometimes before the site's even bought. So it really is about providing our clients with the most informed position, or allowing them to make the most informed decision.
And then what's your view on whether developers should try and find an architect or a designer that focuses on a particular type of product? So whether that might be terrace-style townhouses or...
As in, architects that specialise in terrace homes, or
yes,
architects that specialise...
or small boutique apartment blocks.
Yeah, I think you'll find...
apartments.
Yeah, I think you'll find that there are architects out there that will specialise in apartment developments. There are architects out there that specialise in townhouse developments. There are architects that out there that specialise in commercial projects or retail. Retail's a big one, hospitality, fit outs and stuff like that. A lot of guys that are really specialising in that industry. The medical industry is highly specialised. You don't really go there unless you do that full time. Education is also another specialised industry. I think most architects, and I say this with caution, most architects do a lot of residential and multi-residential, purely because we're in a country where is growing rapidly, and the requirement for housing in Australia is quite high. There is a school of thought out there that there's an oversupply of housing, but there's also a very strong school of thought that there's an undersupply. I think Melbourne's set to be the most populated city in Australia by 2050, and we need housing to support that population growth. And so when you talk about being specialised, most architects in this city will be able to do res because there's such a high demand for it and there's so much of it going on. But there are guys that specialise. I think if you're going to go with someone that isn't seen as a specialist, I wouldn't be worried. I think it's just a case of keeping a bit of a closer eye on them. But I think most architects have the capability of doing multi-res, res work.
So what kind of questions, or how would you go about filtering out or determining an architect to talk to or to work with on a project?
I think the feasibility stuff is important. And it's not so much a range of questions. I mean, anyone can sit there and rattle off answers. As architects, we're a visual medium we produce, and being able to sit down and allow them to produce something and talk to the plan about it with the developer should give that developer a fairly good understanding of where that architect's at and whether they're capable of doing the project. That they should be able to answer all the cues if you're asking them questions, but it's in the drawings that they really speak.
What are the key questions that you would be suggesting people ask?
Well, obviously experience is one. What previous projects have they done? And not only architecturally, but from a development point of view, what's their experience? How have they treated various projects, various problems? How have they dealt with councils? Obviously, the ability to negotiate with council in today's market is incredibly important. Like I mentioned before, if you can have a project that goes in and out of council in 6 months, you're in an incredibly strong position. Whereas if it takes 18 months, well, you're behind the 8 ball and you haven't even sold the project yet. So having an architect who's got a good relationship with the councils is important. Obviously, builders is another facet which is incredibly important. Having a good, strong relationship with the builder. You often hear...
This is the architect?
Yes, yep. Yeah. You often hear horror stories about architects and builders, and they both hate each other, or there's always fights, and this one reckons one thing and the other one thinks another thing. Thank God, touch wood, we've got a pretty good relationship with most of our guys that we've worked with in the last couple of years. And that's really important because, again, it can make that whole experience I was talking about earlier quite sour if you don't get that right. And that's just, I think, about not having an ego about yourself as you go about the project. There are always things that come up in a project through the build. There will be mistakes, whilst we endeavour to have our work flawless, there will be mistakes. And being able to sort through those problems quickly, efficiently, without yelling and screaming at anyone is really important.
Yeah, look, as a developer, you definitely need to be flexible and you just have to solve problems along the way because they pop up.
Of course. It's the nature of the industry. And I mean, the amount of times I've heard, the architect didn't do this, the architect didn't do that. And it's like, well, just hold on. We've produced a lot of stuff here. There are things that are going to pop up and there will be things. So it's the builders got to go about it the right way. Don't be aggressive when they approach the architect with a problem. The architect needs to be mindful that there may be a mistake and cop it on the chin.
Yeah.
Be accepting that there's an issue and just go, okay, well, that's how we're going to work through this together. And we focus on that pretty strongly because it just makes it easier on everyone.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. And I don't recall raising that when I was talking with you guys about the project.
No.
So that might be a question that people tend not to ask the architect.
Well,
what kind of relationship do you have with builders, or how do you ensure you keep that relationship in a good state?
Yeah, I think as long as everybody keeps the project, as the main idea, and not that the egos get in the way at any time. That's the most important thing, for sure. And that goes. That's not just during construction. That goes all the way through. Even at the start of the project. I spoke before about we're talking about design. The architect can't have you can't push your own agenda. It's got to be the project focused. And what's best for the project? What's going to get the best outcome for the project? That might mean the architect not designing exactly what they may have envisioned in the first place, but if it gets the developer a higher yield, well, that's where you want to be, or somewhere in between.
And what about asking about team members, who's going to do what on the project? Is that important, do you think?
Yes and no. I think most groups will have their own set of consultants that they wish to use, and they've probably got a great track record with those groups. Whether that's an issue or not, I don't know. We've got a great team that works with us, and all the guys we've worked with are fantastic. So I don't know whether that's really a big issue unless someone brings up a consultant that you don't like personally. They might not be good. But the other thing is too, whilst we have a team that we work with, we're happy to work with anyone. So sometimes the developer will come to us and say, we don't care who you use your team if you feel more comfortable with them. Or sometimes the guys will come and say, no, we want to use this person, and this person. Can you work with them? And of course you can. We have had there are instances where you do have some bad people, but that's no different to any other industry, I suppose.
Yeah, everything's not going to go swimmingly all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not life.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got to ask you the big question. Architect, well, I was going to say architect versus drafty, but I know there'll be developers out there who will be thinking, architects are just expensive drafties and they don't add any additional value to the design.
I thought you were going to say expensive drama queens in for a second.
Well, we're not focusing on any individuals here at the moment, Dom.
Yeah.
But there'll be people out there who have that view that architects are expensive and they don't necessarily add any additional value to the design or to the project.
Yep.
What's your view on that?
That's a tough question. And I say it's a tough question because there are a lot of good draftsmen out there doing really good work. I know a couple of them, and I've recommended to other people, to some clients in the past. Don't necessarily think the question's about architects versus draftsmen. It's more a question of who's the best consultant for the project. What an architect does give you is, when you approach a project, there's two, I guess, big risks, I suppose. One is obtaining a planning permit. Well, there's more. There's a few risks. One's obtaining a planning permit. Two is obviously the documentation of the project and being able to execute that in a mindful way, or a proper way. And three is developing a product that the client feels comfortable in selling, or if it's a house, the client feels comfortable in living in, or if it's an office, whatever the end game is. If we talk about the planning aspect, councils are conscious these days of the design quality coming out in their respective municipalities. Councils will always prefer to have an architect as the design consultant on the submission, just because they feel as though they're going to get a better product. I'm not saying they necessarily will all the time. I'm just saying that that's the, I guess, perception from a council member. If you're talking about a multi-unit development, the developer should be choosing a consultant that's going to give them the best outcome, and that's not just from a yield perspective; it's from a design perspective. What's a product going to be? Quite often, you will find that a greater quality of design in the project will allow that there's more potential to get over and above what the standard might be at council. For example, if there's, as I mentioned before, res code's only a guide, so there are at times opportunities to exceed it. Let's say that there is a maximum site coverage on a site of 60%, and let's say there's a height restriction of 9 metres or 10 metres, right? In some cases, and not in all, but in some cases, if you've got a very high quality of design, you may go to 75% or 70%, 75%. You may be able to go 3 stories with a 4th story that's set back on all the top levels that you can't see, which is over and above what the ResGo's guidelines are proposing for this particular site. But council recognises that there is a higher quality of design. They recognise that they're going to get a better product in the street, so they see it as better of a design outcome. And obviously, the developer gets more yield. They've got an extra half level. They've got some extra area on the site, which might in turn result in an additional 1 or 2, 3, 10, I don't know, depending on how big it is or whatever it is. And that's something that's really important. It's really about pushing boundaries, and you can only do that through design. If you turn up to council and have something that's pretty crappy and just one doesn't look good and isn't presented properly, council will just go, no, not interested. But if you can turn up with a really nice, neat package, some really great diagrams that communicate all the ideas in it, some example, a written dialogue of what you're proposing, some really neat 3D visual renders that show what the project what it's going to look like. People moving through it, living in it. So you really make it an exciting and mouth-watering proposition for the council. Get them engaged in it, and then all of a sudden things can start to happen for you. I may be talking about it at kind of a suburban level, but that goes right up into larger developments. An example, we did a project down in Abbotsford, and I think the height limit was 6 stories.
Which is inner city Melbourne for
those
Melbourne listeners.
We went in with a 12-story scheme, which was 6 levels above the recommendation. Now that got refused at council, but with the VCAT. Now we ended up with 10 levels, and council saw that as the VCAT member draw the conclusion that it was a great design, and therefore merit should be given. And that was through additional height. So to come back to your original question about using an architect or a drafty or which consultant, as I changed it around a little bit, you really have to find a consultant that I think has a high quality design in their work. Because if you do and you run with that person, then you can potentially use design, and not always, doesn't always work, but you can potentially use design to get you additional yield, additional area, which is obviously going to make the development more profitable, hopefully. That also, just going back a step, when you talk about product and you go into the market, it's important having a good looking building. If you can't go to the market with some sexy renders and some great usable floor plans, you might be in strife. Quite often we'll pick up a project that's got an existing permit, and that you'll see 2.7, 2.6 metre wide bedrooms, and they're just not. You can't do that. I don't believe that's a viable product in today's market. So, the market's a bit more savvy these days. They're a bit more sophisticated. They know what they want and what's expected. So having the right plan is really important. We all know that everything's getting smaller, so design is becoming more important. And again, that comes back to the consultant and ensuring you've got a consultant that's going to work hard to deliver the right product.
And I've got a view that your local drafty in a particular council or that works across certain areas with certain authorities or councils, whatever it is in your local area, I've got this view that they don't rock the boat for you as much as, say, an architect who's really focused on you as a client and getting an outcome would. with council. That's just my view. I don't think they would go in as hard as an architect would, because they've got 6, 7, 8, 10 other clients in with council, and they don't want to upset council and have to deal with them on these other ones. So that's just my view.
I don't know about the politics of what you're talking about. It's probably something a little bit different. There's plenty of architects out there that don't want to rock the boat either. I really don't think it's an argument of architects versus draftsmen. It's an argument of who is going to provide you with the best service in terms of design. So who's going to work their bums off to create a design outcome that may be pushing boundaries, that may be over and above what they typically do, but is ultimately gives you the best hope in delivering the highest return. So if you want to categorise them as architect versus draftsman, then go for it. I'm not willing to do that because I think there's pretty good drafters out there that do the same thing, and there's plenty of bad architects that don't do that, that are acting in the way you're suggesting is a poor way to go. So I think it's more about just finding out the architect or finding the designer, the right designer for you, and perhaps looking through their previous work and their previous experience, and maybe discussing, why did they do this, why did they do that, what led them to create this particular design outcome, and maybe ask them, was that over and above what was expected on that site? Because it can often, that's where the value is. If you go and buy a site that's worth, let's say, for argument's sake, there's a site that's, let's say, one would assume you can get 12 townhouses on there, for argument's sake, right? And let's say, and I'm just hypothetical, let's say, just to keep it simple, that it's 100, it's based on 100,000 per townhouse on that site. So the value of the land's $1.2 million. If, let's say, you go to designer 1, designer 2, and designer 1 gives you 12 townhouses, and designer 2 comes back with 20, for argument's sake. Now, assuming they're all similar sizes, but you've been able to go about it a different way, and let's assume, for the argument of this discussion, that they both get permits. The value of the land hasn't changed with the 12 townhouse scheme. It's still worth 1.2, 1.3. Maybe a bit more because there's certainty in the permit. But the one with the 20 is obviously worth a lot more, because if you're basing it on similar returns, you're talking about something that's worth $2 million. Now, we often talk about value and how it's pretty hard to quantify design in our industry, and I think a lot of architects have perhaps struggled with how do you quantify what you do. That building over there might look good to you, but I might think it's horrible. So how do we value it? You can't. But when it comes to development, you can, because these are real numbers. This scheme returned you an additional 100,000. This scheme returned you an additional 800,000, and all of a sudden the value of design starts to become quite evident.
Yeah, and it's a question I often ponder as well. How much does the design influence the speed of sale, or the buyer's decision to choose your product over something else?
Yep.
It's very hard to quantify that without going out and specifically asking buyers why they chose it.
Yeah.
But it definitely plays a role. You've got a good-looking building over here versus a standard building over there.
A typical residential development, and there's nothing wrong with those.
No,
and there's a place for them. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, but quantifying that decision why the buyer would go, well, I'm going over there with a nice building, rather than sticking to the ordinary building, because I want to live somewhere that looks a bit different and looks great.
Yep, and there's a lot of people out there that also prefer to live in the traditional archetype, I suppose. It's really a subjective thing. And this is my point. You're talking about typical townhouses versus, say, something more contemporary. And I'm saying leave that argument to the side when it comes to design. Obviously it's something to discuss, but when you talk about value, that's kind of irrelevant. The relevance is what the yield and what you can get through council, because the value of the land, the land doesn't change, but all of a sudden you've got a permit. One permit gives you 12 townhouses or 13, the other one gives you 18 to 20. Which block of land's worth more? Obviously the one with more on it. And the value of the land, that nothing's happened on the land. The only difference is design. And that design can then you can start to see how the design can play a role in increasing value. And that's where, and it works both ways. You can decrease land by doing that too. But I think that's where the value of design is quite tangible, quite visible. It's real. Why people choose properties is a whole another discussion. And quite often, the reasons for choosing a property may have nothing to do with architecture or design. It might be they just like that street. So, or proximity to a school, or freeways, access, public transport, or who knows.
So when you first look at a possible site for development, or a developer brings you a site and says, we're looking at this,
Yep.
What are the things that you start immediately thinking about?
Look, zoning is the number one thing. Zoning is the planning zoning and what you can and can't do with that site. They'll tell us whether we can go 2 stories, 4 stories, 10 stories. They'll tell us what maximum site coverage we've got to play with. Whether there's any vegetation overlays. There's a heritage overlay. It's often a big one that plays a major part in development. So the planning overlays is probably the number one thing to begin with. I think any developers out there looking for sites, they should be at the same time looking at what the zoning. Every time they think they got one, have a look at the zoning, because that's the first thing I'll do, and I'll be like, well, you can't really do much here, or actually you can only subdivide the land into 2, so you can't really do much. So that's the number one thing. The second one is obviously what's around you, both kind of immediately in the immediate area and secondary. So what are your neighbours doing? Where are their private open spaces? How do you impact them? Where are their north-facing windows? What's your access like to the site? Do you have a secondary access point from the rear, or are you coming off a main road? Or all these things become critical. And then obviously the second part of that is what's the greater context. So access to public transport, access to parklands and waterways. All those type of things become other things. Activity centres, how close they are, to an area where there is kind of more significant development. And you may already be in that area, so that lends itself to greater development potential.
And then I've just found out that context is very important. I had a colleague who had an application knocked back by council, which was in a high density or a medium density zone. Council knocked it back. They went to the planning tribunal.
I know what you're going to ask me.
And the planning tribunal knocked it back.
Yeah.
And their primary reason was context. Even though it was clearly within this zone that was marked for higher intensity development.
Yep.
Because of the street that it was on with lower density development, it got knocked back, and it was about context.
Yeah.
Which is something that I probably wouldn't have given as much weight to.
Yeah,
perhaps.
well, the council has their local planning policies in place, and they'll look at areas and they'll say that they'll determine that they want a specific area to hold high density development. The problem is if you don't get a permit with council, VCAT will look at it from a more holistic point of view. They'll acknowledge the fact that council have zoned it in a higher density area, but VCAT will look at it and say, well, sure, but is it ready for it? And if you're talking about a street that's all single homes, not on a main road, well, is that site really a higher, set for higher density development? It's probably not. And now I don't know anything about this development that you're talking about. I haven't seen the drawings. I don't know where it is, or what the context is. So I can't comment on that one specifically. But when you are looking at the zoning, you need to, and that's why I said zoning first, but then you've got to look at the context as well. Because regardless of the zoning, there are certain things you can't do.
Yeah, because I would have looked at that and gone, this particular zone,
Yep.
They're encouraging higher density of development. Yep. Great.
Yep.
We should be able to. You'd be able to get this type of development through a high density.
Yeah, well,
but no, it's not black and white. I guess is the point I'm making, which is frustrating.
And this is something that frustrates us all the time. That call it the general residential zone, which is common throughout Victoria. That has typically a 9 metre height limit. Now, if I said to you, you've got a 9 metre height limit, one would expect that you can go 3 stories on that site, but you can't. Well, you can, but not always. So if you've got a street that's all single level dwellings, it's highly likely that council will only allow you to go to 2 levels, and that's one above what the existing character is. Even though the policies might permit you to go 3 levels, the context really does inform whether you can or you can't. So the context is incredibly important. It's not just about the zoning. It's not just, well, if they say I can go this high, then you can go. It doesn't work like that. Are they going to have a crack at another scheme? Or
They're considering their options at the moment, but it was a good wake-up call for me.
Yeah. So tell us, was it a townhouse project or?
Yeah, it was a townhouse project, sort of terrace style townhouses on a 2,200 square metre block.
So it's quite big, yeah.
Big block, well below the threshold density that had been identified by council in one of their strategy documents. So it kind of seemed to tick all the boxes, but no.
Interesting.
I just made the point just around, I would have thought that was a laydown is there that you would be able to get that one through.
Look, they may have ran into a Conservative member at VCAT. They may have ran into a planner who perhaps is, again, more conservative. Don't know.
Yeah.
Councils can be frustrating to work with at times because it can sometimes depend on the planner. Obviously, it depends on whether you get objectors or not. There's a number of determining factors that change the outcome of a project quite significantly without the actual project changing. So,
well, I think that's what happened with this one. The locals, the neighbours, did object quite vociferously, and council obviously took that into account and then sort of backed off their initial support. Yeah. So there's quite a lot of variables going into the planning application and the planning phase. So you're right. Once you do get that planning permit, you've got a degree of certainty. And
then that's the biggest risk, in my opinion, is the planning. I mean, if you go and buy a site and you base your numbers on getting 10 houses, you'd want to be getting 10. If you can get 12 of them, brilliant, great. If you get 8, you might be in a bit of trouble. So, and the sad thing is, if you do get 8, and this is the thing that irks me a little bit, is if you do get 8, what happens then is, to make it work, you've got to build a substandard product to get your money back. So what often happens is you end up building crap, and then selling crap, and then these people buy them and they're living in something that perhaps would have been a bit nicer if council allowed us to get a bit more on there. So that's the frustrating thing, I think, from our point of view. We've got one at the moment, a similar argument I was talking about, it's going to be heading into VCAT, where we're pushing for 3 levels. It's permissible, it's opposite a park. We've got 3 levels and 2-level townhouses. 3-level ones, as I said, look over a park. They don't affect anybody. It's actually the perfect spot for a 3-level townhouse. The living areas have got a balcony that overlooks the park. Above that, we have a master bedroom with their own private terrace that overlooks the park. Now, that quality of townhouse isn't really, you don't see that in the area that we're doing this, and it would be something a bit nicer. Now, we could be forced into a position where they all become 2 stories. The developer will probably spend less money on them, and we're going to get an inferior product, and I think that'd be a real shame. So, anyway, hopefully common sense prevails, but you never know.
No. Sense and common are not 2 words.
I think that's a big thing that the councils and VCAT need to be conscious of, and that is the quality of the product needs to be considered. If you've got a product if you've got a house that, or townhouse has got access to natural light to all its bedrooms, nice high big windows, nice 2.7 metre high ceilings and living spaces, think about the product, less about sometimes how high. We always talk about height. We don't often talk about quality.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I think this is where the difference between a good designer and an average designer. You just get those little 1%ers along the way that begin to add up over time, and as your planning application builds. Because I've seen people get into trouble with substandard design, basically, and then when they have to try and justify it, they can't. And it falls over. And they've lost time, they've spent money on consultants, all sorts of stuff. Whereas if they'd invested a bit more money,
it comes back to one of
they would have they may have got it through.
Yeah, it comes back to one of your questions earlier regarding who do you choose. And I think you mentioned that architects are more expensive, say, than a draftsman, as you said. Extra money up front will probably, sometimes, hopefully, you'd like to think would save you time at planning and will return you a better product, which is going to return you a higher selling price. So that extra small amount at the front might result in significant savings in terms of time, and then potentially more profits through the sales period. So yes, some might look at it as a greater investment at the front, but I think it comes back to how do you value what you do. I'd like to think that we can nail those two things that I mentioned, and therefore the client's in a better position.
You've worked with a lot of developers over the years. What mistakes do you see them making?
Well, one I just mentioned. I think if you skimp early on a consultants, I think you may get yourself in trouble in the long run. Even if you just take architecture out of it for the time being. Let's say you choose an engineer. Right? And let's say the engineer is $5,000 cheaper than the next one, for argument's sake. Now, the more expensive engineer may work a bit harder to find a better design solution for the structure. That might result in a $50,000 savings in steel, and that's quite a substantial difference. And that's all because we're talking about a $5,000 difference at the front. That they're big mistakes. If you go with a substandard designer, you might be stuck in council for 18 months. We did have a case where one guy approached us and he'd been using an architect that had been moonlighting at home whilst he was working for another group. And he was complaining that his planning application for a house had been in planning for 18 to 24 months nearly. And he didn't end up going with us due to fees, but we're kind of like, well, there's probably the problem. It's just you're using someone that's probably not putting the right time and effort into the project, and then that's having a negative outcome at planning, which is going to upset the whole project. So little things like that. I think consultants is really important. I think doing your due diligence. I think having chat to agents and working out what your product is, who your market is, who's your target audience is really important. Are you going to investors or are you going to owner-occupiers? Because that really does inform how you really approach a project from a design sense. So just getting all your ducks in line at the start of a project is really important, and then hopefully everything should just flow on quite nicely. Yeah, so they're the major ones I'd say from my point of view. Obviously getting your pricing right is really important. If you're trying to sell something that's more expensive than not, you're probably going to fall over. I think marketing is the other important one. Spending money on a really tight marketing campaign is critical, because obviously that's what's selling the project. Go and spend money on the good vendors. Get your interiors team to develop up really tight interiors. They're the main things, I think. And listen to the consultants. They're the ones that know what they're doing in that particular issue. So if you can trust them, I think everything should move a bit more smoothly.
Yeah, look, the question of trust is obviously a big one with your team, because if you've got that trust, then you can allow them to do their job.
Yes.
If you don't have
Sit
that
back
trust,
and relax.
you're sort of always wondering whether you're getting the right advice, or are you just getting the advice that's the easiest for the consultant, so they can just get the job done as quickly as possible and off their desk.
And often that, I've been talking about this with my business partner a lot recently. We often have negotiate with our clients in terms of fees, and it gets to a point where you kind of have to say, look, if I reduce it any further, this is going to impact on your project. Now, I would like to be able to give it the right time that it needs to deliver the right product, but what happens is sometimes you can get negotiated down to a point where, and this might be, this is for everyone, I'm not talking just from ourselves, where there may not be a lot of money in it. So it comes to just saying whatever they want just because they need to get this project off the table. That does happen, which I think is not great, and I think consultants should do that, but that's a reality.
Well,
So-
it creates resentment.
Yeah,
I think you need to be aware of that not just as a developer, but just whenever you're negotiating with people. Is this concept of fair exchange?
yeah. And then
What is it that they're delivering, and
yeah.
what are you paying for? And if you
Exactly.
screw them down below what they think they're
And that's
worth,
what- yeah.
there's going to be ongoing, lingering resentment that will present somewhere in some way.
And I think from our perspective, we tend to negotiate more on scope as opposed to fees. So rather than saying, okay, we can do it cheaper, it's more a case of, right, well, what can we eliminate from the fees? That means, you might take on some of these roles, or you might take out a certain component and expect someone else to do it. So there are ways of doing it. So just to ensure that the product is still being maintained, the quality of service is still being maintained. But I think that's something that sometimes people fail to recognise. Obviously, everyone wants everything at an affordable rate. Everyone's out there trying to make the most. So we understand that. But if the quality of service is being dropped, well, then they're not getting what they really want, I think.
And I think that's a really good point for developers to consider when they're talking to architects, is to ask that question about scope, perhaps, rather than just decrease your fees.
Yeah.
Well, okay, what can we
What can we
change?
do? Yeah.
What can you do less of, perhaps, or what can I do more of, just to try and get to a level that everyone's happy with?
Yep. And because whenever anyone asks us for a fee, we provide a full services package. So what we offer is project conception to handover and full kind of management right through. Now, not everyone requires that. We're doing a fair bit of work with some builders, their own houses or their own little developments, and they don't need a full set of documentation drawings because they know how to build it. So what we provide is a building permit package, which is a fair bit less, almost half, and that allows them to get what they want. Then they can go and build it. They've saved significant fees. We even had one guy that didn't want any interiors because he said, well, I'm just going to get things I've done in other projects, I'm just going to replicate them myself, so I don't need it. So he was able to get an architectural product for quite a fair bit cheaper just because he was able to eliminate the scope for us, which we're happy to do. But not everyone has that opportunity. Not everyone builders, not everyone has access to interior projects or interior design elements.
Yeah, it's a good idea. Don't just look at the bottom line of the fee proposal and go yes or no.
Yeah.
Look a little bit deeper and talk to the architect or the designer and find out where there's some middle ground, maybe.
One of the funny ones is that the contract administration component of a project, or the construction phase services, we often get asked, what is that and why do I need that? And it's actually an incredibly important part of the project. For those listening who don't know, it's where you've got the client and the builder will have a contract, a building contract, and the architect will typically they get an architect or a project manager to manage that process, and they have to administer the contract. They ensure that the builder's being paid, and we ensure that the builder's building essentially what's on the drawings, and they're not overquoting for things that aren't on site. And that's a really important part of the project, and a lot of people that don't understand that will often say, oh, well, I don't need that, and I'll take it out. Many times it's come back in, and they've said, and we've got some of our builders that say, well, we won't do it unless the architect's engaged to administer, because the builder doesn't want to talk to someone who doesn't know anything about the project or the detail of the project. So,
yeah, look, I can certainly attest to the value of having an architect do that, because we're currently having that done for us at the moment, and I would be sinking in the queries that are coming through from the builder related to the project.
And they're not, I mean, you might think that they're queries that should have been, and it comes back to what I was saying at the beginning of this chat, is you can't document absolutely everything. It's just not feasible. So there are often things that come up through the building process where the architect needs to be, on deck. They're with the ability to answer questions when required, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, and some of them you just don't know what the answer is.
No, until something happens or they're getting through it, and that's just part of the process.
Yeah, I know we've had questions around depth levels for water retention systems. I'm like, well, I don't know what that is. Just call the architect.
Yeah, call the architect. Not my problem.
Yeah, and then they just go, yeah, it's XYZ.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Solved.
Yeah, and we've got all the drawings here, so it's a matter of just referring to them. We know what we're looking for. You can sort something out in 20 minutes as opposed to potentially someone who hasn't had that experience, hasn't been involved in the drawing of the documentation process. It may take them a day. Now, if you add that up over the life of the project, you're talking about months.
Yeah, and it's time that you can then be focused on finding the next deal or solving other problems.
Yep. So that's a really important part of a project. It often gets lost because if you don't have a lot of experience in the game, well, you probably see an architect as, well, they just do drawing. They just produce a set of drawings for council and for building, and that's kind of it. Well, I'd like to think it's a little bit more.
What one tip do you have for developers so they can take their developing to the next level?
It's a good question, and I think the quality of product, as I've mentioned a few times, is really important. I know there's a few developers out there. I remember catching up with Paul Fridman from Fridcorp a couple of years ago, and he mentioned that he spends about 10 to 15% more on his interiors in his projects, right, than say a typical developer would. That's probably through both design and quality of finishes and whatnot. And that's because in a lot of his projects, he gets a lot of return buyers. I think that's really important. Again, quality of design. I keep mentioning quality of design. It's really, really important. If you can set up a portfolio of work as a developer that is of good quality, you can set up potentially a system of return buyers. And if you've got, if you're embarking on a new project of, 50 townhouses, and you can sell 25 of them to people that are in other developments that you've done, your job's half done. And that flows on and on and on and on and on. So quality of projects is important. The second reason why quality of projects is important, from a council perspective, if you've got projects that look great, being developed, they're operating, in a local area, and everyone's talking about how great that development is. The next project that you go in with the same design team, same developer, same architect, similar product, do you think they're going to look at it favourably? Of course they are. So your risk component is getting smaller at council, and then obviously in the sales. So quality of product, I think spend the money, get it right, get the product right, market it right, because it'll make things easier in the long run.
Great tip.
And it's a better outcome for the community, which is really important. It's not just about the developer. I think if we can ensure that what we're putting out there is a benefit to everybody, then again, it's a better outcome.
Yeah, I like that idea because I think that's really important when you can put your hand on your heart and go, we really are adding value to the community.
Yep.
The design fabric of the area is actually being enhanced by the product that we're putting out there.
Yep.
I think there's real long-term value to that, not just economic, but also community value.
Yeah, and look, I was talking to one of our urban designers the other day about apartment sizes. Everyone's, it's a hot topic at the moment. They're too small, whatever. But I think we have to recognise that it's not the size that's important. It's how it's designed. If you do have a sub 50 square metre apartment, what that does is it allows either first-time investor or a first-time buyer that perhaps can't afford the $1 million house, but they can afford the $500,000 apartment, right, all of a sudden it gets them in the market. So those apartments play a pivotal role. I don't necessarily believe that it's just a case of going, anything less than 50 square metres is off the table. No, that needs to be there because it provides an incredibly important role in the community. But how it's designed, that's the important part. If you can get it right, then all of a sudden you can provide a really neat, cool studio apartment that someone can live in and really enjoy their time in there, and then brilliant. Why not have them? If it's affordable as well. Affordable being the number one thing.
All right, Dom, we might leave it there.
Cool.
Thank you very much for being on the Property Developer Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, there you have it. A far-reaching discussion on design and property developing with a gun architect. I hope you picked up some useful tips and ideas, because I thought we unearthed a couple of nuggets of gold. There's a few things I would definitely suggest to any developer looking to find a new designer for their next project. And they are: 1. See if the designer will do a quick feasibility for you. This will help you establish if they understand the market you are working in. They may charge a small fee for this, but I think it would be worth it to determine what they think they can get on the site and how they assess the local market. It will also give you a bit of an idea of what it would be like to work with the designer. 2. Ask the architect how they manage relationships with builders. This is a great question because the builder is so important, and the relationship between the architect and builder is critical to getting the build done as quickly and efficiently as possible. So, ask how do they ensure they stay on good terms. Even ask to speak with a couple of the builders they are currently working with. Give them a call and I'm pretty sure they'll tell you how they see it. 3. Find a designer who has a high quality of design in their work. It is better to find a designer who has a history of producing high quality work than trying to push someone to come up with a better design. Most designers should be able to provide plenty of visual examples of what they have done. Importantly, Dom suggested you ask whether the end result was over and above the developer's expectations, or if it was less. Quality of product is really important, so it is prudent not to mess about on it. What would happen if you spent 10 to 15% more on your design? Would you get your permit faster? Would you sell quicker? Would you get an extra 10 to 20% on your end sale price? I reckon that initial investment would be worth it. 4. Negotiate on scope, not on fees. Don't just focus on the lowest cost when assessing design proposals. I like the idea of negotiating around scope rather than simply lowest cost. As I mentioned, if you screw people down too far, it will foster resentment, which will show up somewhere along the line. So discuss with the architect or designer how the fee structure could be different if the scope shifted, and see what you could do or get someone else to do. And remember, you may save time and ultimately money by investing upfront in great design from a good designer. So there you have some pretty valuable tips and ideas that could save you a lot of time and money and deliver higher returns. If you'd like to find out more about Cera Stribley Architects, you can check out their website at cerastribley.com. That wraps up another show. Head over to iTunes for a review if you've got some value from this episode, or stop by the Property Developer Podcast website for more developing gold. And until next time, may all your developments look sweet and sell fast.
You've been listening to the Property Developer Podcast. Tune in next time for more tips, ideas, and inspiration to take your developing to the next level. For more developing love, make sure to visit propertydeveloperpodcast.com.